Hi guys, I'm Maya, and I'm going to be leading the discussion on The Ways of Seeing by John Berger, Part 1, pages 1 through 81, or the first four chapters. Three, two, one. Three, two, one. Three. Get out of my face. Bam. Three, two, one. Hi guys, I'm Maya, and I'm going to be doing today's leading discussion on The Ways of Seeing by John Berger, Part 1, which is pages 1 through 81, or the first four chapters. So, just as a general overview, Berger discussed how images as a form of art provide a different meaning than paintings and their reproductions, and historically, how those paintings have been used to justify certain things, as well as men and women socially influencing artwork throughout history, and the nude of a person as a work of art across cultures. So, as Berger discussed with his first chapter, knowledge never fits the sight of something truly incredible. And what he meant by that was when you're seeing something, there's no way you can truly describe what you're seeing that can so truly help somebody see what you're seeing in the way that a painting or a photograph might. And that is something that artists have been able to do across time, which is allow people to see what they were seeing. And that leads into how he discussed that every image embodies a way of seeing, so to speak. And he means this in the sense of perspective, how each painting, each image shows somebody's point of view, somebody's perspective on something, and how, as he quotes, no other relic or text but images offer such a direct testimony about the world. Because with paintings, their meaning and their depictions are often left up to interpretation by art historians and by those who are viewing them, because the artist is not around anymore to then describe how they wanted somebody to feel or what they wanted somebody to think when they were looking at their art. It can be completely edited and changed by people in the future. Whereas an image, you see what was happening, you see what they saw from their perspective, you are able to look at the world through their own lens for the first time. However, this often leads to assumptions that naturally happen with art that we've learned throughout time and just come naturally. So when an image is presented as art, we look at these assumptions, such as its beauty, its truth, genius, civilization, form, status, taste. The list goes on. And we don't realize that this is part of why we look at certain things and question, is this art? Is this really art? Does this count as art? Because we've been conditioned to believe that paintings and the masters are what artwork is. That needs to come from your hands, come from your own skills, come from your own talents for it to count as art. With images, that was hard to look at still. From there, he talks about how works of art were made unnecessarily remote and that art of the past is mystified. And from that, he meant that often, like with Frans Hals, who painted a work of art, the Regents of the Old Men's Almshouse and the Regentesses of the Old Men Almshouse, in which the author who was describing the piece knew his history, knew how those people treated that artist, and yet doesn't talk about that, says there's no evidence that leads to what he would have painted, that there's no evidence that there was any sort of bitterness in this painting, when arguably you could see that bitterness come forth in both of those paintings. And this mystification comes from those assumptions in the idea that you need to know how to truly interpret a work of art. Can you understand these things about a work of art to truly know what you're looking at? And it was meant to separate the social classes with people who were considered more elite and more wealthy, who had access to these pieces of art, versus the people who were more poor and did not have access to well done paintings that these elitists would have seen. And by being able to separate the classes, by separating them, they are able to then lie about maybe what was represented in that work, what was discussed in that work. They used this idea that they were highly educated compared to those around them as a means of saying, well, you wouldn't understand. You're not educated, you wouldn't understand. Because back then, paintings used to be as unique to and for the buildings they were for. There wasn't two of the same thing being made for somebody. If somebody ordered something for a church, that church is going to have that one painting. There's nowhere else that's going to have that. And with time, this has changed as Berger discusses how these paintings lose their meaning with reproduction, whereas with the invention of the camera, cameras diversified meanings through traveling because while paintings, they were so unique that that's what made them valuable. They were very unique. They were something to behold for the people who had access to them. And the artist was able to say, this is what my art is for, this is what it means. And the camera, however, you're able to quite literally capture the world from your perspective as you see it and present it that way. And that is something that cannot be mystified, that cannot be looked at by elitists to say, well, obviously they're not showing this. They're not talking about this. This is not, you know, here. Obviously, this is just meant to represent something. With paintings, as time goes on and the people who remember them forget, you can then say, well, their faces looked like this because they were trying to seduce you, or they're posed like this because that was normal. Or in the instance of Frans Hals, there is a man in the painting who has his hat on strange and he looks a bit drunk, but somebody who's trying to uphold those social classes is going to say, well, that was just the time. He wanted to appear funny rather than paint these elitists potentially in a bad light, in which he was probably just drunk. And, as these paintings lose their meaning with the reproduction, as what he means is with these things no longer being unique, their value is lost in that instead of its value coming from what it means, its value is now in that it's the original of a reproduction. You now have an original, and that's what makes it special. It's the first. Whereas cameras, you can capture that moment through traveling. So you can reproduce the same picture, but it might not always be the same. And now after I open this discussion, I'm just gonna want you guys to pause the video, discuss, and I will discuss my feelings on the matter afterwards. But I want you guys to discuss, why do you think there was a connection between education levels and interest in art? And how do you think that connection might currently be shaping society overall? And another one is, do you think the originals of paintings diminish in their value with each reproduction? Why or why not? Okay, so for me, I personally feel that the reason there's a connection between education and interest in art is just exposure. When you're not exposed to new ideas and to new things, you will not really gain an interest in them. If you live your life in a bubble, you'll never know what's on the outside. And oftentimes, many people are introduced to art and art history through classes at school. Without that access, more often than not, you're probably not going to be very interested in it. So, for me, I wasn't particularly interested in historical illustrations until I took my historical illustration class and realized just how much of what I learned was coming from these masters of the past and their techniques. And it gave me something to think about. And I would not have had access to a lot of that had I not been here at SCAD for that class. And with that connection, it just shows how having an education is so, so important into knowing your true histories and to knowing that not everything you just hear from other people might be true. You need that education for yourself. So that's how that I feel that that connection kind of currently shapes society in and of itself right now. As for the originals of paintings, as much as I want to say no, their value doesn't diminish because of this, I can understand where Berger was coming from in that when I thought about it, it would make sense as to why certain people just value certain art more. For instance, you know, people really love the Mona Lisa, but the Mona Lisa has reproductions like that happened at the same time. And part of I think that what makes people think, well, this is the Mona Lisa, is it's the original. I feel that in discussion of art, there is a lot of talk of, well, this is the original, or when there are paintings that are very similar or nearly identical, we're trying to find the original. So I think that, yes, just because of the way we work now and the way we work value, the way we consider things to be valuable, I think that yes, unfortunately, the originals of paintings, their value from what the original artists thought they would be does diminish, as more and more people look upon it and make assumptions, and then as more and more reproductions are made. And just to connect back to last class, we saw examples in the second chapter of still life, and in our last class, we talked about ready-made art. And so I used the example of Marcel Duchamp and Jean-Simeon Chardin. And I have no idea if I just butchered those names, but anyway, so ready-made is about taking mass-produced objects and giving them new meaning by putting them through an artistic lens and making people see things in a different light, forcing people to see things as they might not have seen them before. And still life, while not about the same thing, is kind of similar in a way, where it could have potentially been the ready-made of its time, as still lives often depict items that really wouldn't have that same value outside the arts. Because outside of the arts, that is just a snow shovel. Outside of the arts, that is just some food and a knife and a table. So it's incredible to think how art has evolved in this way where we have changed certain things that are so similar to each other and could probably be traced back to each other in that sense of how ready-made is kind of just photographic still life, where back in the past, if you wanted to study these objects, you had to draw them, but now you can take a picture of that object and you can present it in a completely different way. Then through the third chapter, Berger talked about how men and women are perceived differently by themselves and each other, how their external or internal presence is felt and affects their artistic depictions. For instance, he talks about how a man's presence is through what he feels he can do to you or for you as a human, and how these factors that determine a man's presence are often external. And if a man feels he is lacking in any of these items, his presence is often small and diminished, and vice versa. Whereas with women, our presence is more internal and is more about what we determine can and cannot be done to ourselves. And it was a very interesting read. And I definitely had many thoughts about that as it was going through, but it was incredible to learn how he described the way women look at the world and how people look at women existing in the world. And he then discussed the nude and nakedness and how women are often depicted in the nude. And the nude is, it's an older art form and it's artistically inclined compared to nakedness and sexuality, whereas nakedness, Berger described as being just without clothing. You exist without clothes. That's just being naked. Whereas in the nude, it has this almost inherent sexuality in that that image is intended for the viewer to look. And in this example, these examples, the viewer is the true lover of a woman in these sexually themed arts where she is looking back. But at the same time, coming back to that idea that women are both existing and watched as existing comes to this idea that Berger talks about being women having a split being due to growing up in a world scrutinized by men. And how these two halves, one is, as he puts it, the surveyor, and the other is the surveyed. And he talks about how a woman watches herself as well as watching others. She watches herself being watched. And the passage that discusses how a woman's actions determine how she thinks that she should be treated, whereas men, it's just an action. That is one I a little bit disagreed with. But you can see here in this other painting, she is viewing herself as we are also viewing her. So she joins the people who are spectating her. Now, I'm going to pause here again. I want you guys to pause after the discussion. I want you guys to talk about this. So in the third essay, Berger claims that a man's presence is tied to the power that he holds, which is often from those external factors like testosterone or friendship, while a woman's presence is internal, shaping what can and cannot be done to her. He also suggests that a woman's sense of self is split between being the observer and the observed as a result of navigating a world that's been structured by men. What were your initial reactions to this passage? Did you think this idea of presence still holds true in certain situations today? And where, if so, does this perspective seem outdated? Okay, now that you guys have time to discuss. For me, my initial reaction was at first I was very confused because it seemed like there was a lot of filler to basically saying women watch themselves and are hyper aware of their surroundings. And this whole concept of, in today's terms, would be dressing for the male or female gaze. And it's something that I feel like this idea of presence definitely still holds true today, where men who I have noticed in my own personal life, where they feel that they are lacking in what is defined traditionally as masculinity, they are more dangerous in a strange way in that men who are not lacking, who have these large presences and this great amount of power that they exude, they often bring a very intimidating but calm kind of presence to a room. Whereas with the stuff for women, I was looking at it and I was like, at first was almost offended because I didn't quite understand what he was trying to say until I read it aloud to myself and realized that yes, he is just talking about, the male or female gaze and women being hyper aware of their surroundings pretty much at any given time, and that includes themselves. Um, but I feel as though, as I discussed earlier, that the passage that discussed how what a woman is doing determines how she wants to be treated by other people, and how when a man does those same actions, it's just because he's doing them, which Berger defines as a man acts, women appear. That I feel definitely is outdated in today's standards, simply due to the fact that I feel most women would not say that they're acting a particular way because that's how they want to be treated. I feel like that's true for anyone, regardless of gender, where if you are behaving poorly, that reflects badly on you. And if people treat that person badly because they are behaving poorly, then that's their problem. But to say that a man can be angry and that's just because he's mad, whereas a woman will get angry, but that's because she wants to be treated as though she is always angry, I feel is quite outdated because it paints this picture that it paints a picture that feels like meant to blame women for the way we are treated by society sometimes, just for trying to exist in the same space. So I feel like that kind of concept was a bit outdated, unless, of course, I misunderstood that section in which it's fine. And now I want to do a little experiment based on the end of that fourth chapter. And I want you guys to take a look at these two paintings featured in the book. And I want you to imagine the women in these paintings as men. How do your assumptions about the image change, if at all? Okay. So this was a little experiment that Berger offered at the end of the fourth chapter to basically discuss the way women are often depicted in art and how if men are portrayed in the same way, it is very interesting. And of course, will change, I feel, for me, because it definitely changes the idea. Because often this pose is like meant to sexualize a woman and to show off her body, whereas for men, this might come across, and I am looking at this through a very strange lens, in that these poses, especially the one on the right, give this idea that this man could be exuding power, that he's just comfortable in his skin and what he is, versus, the current image, which she is lying there very seductively and is looking back at the viewer, because as stated earlier, the viewer is the lover of the woman in these pieces where she is looking back at you. And it gets interesting in the one on the left because then you get this weird idea where why is somebody who looks to be with the face of a child gripping a man in this way? It's looked at very differently. And it can be uncomfortable in a weirdest way because men are not often depicted in this form, to the point that male nudity in a work of art is more invoking of a revolting reaction, whereas with women, it's just natural and normal. And now I want you guys to discuss after that exercise to just take some time to look closely at these paintings by Sylvia Slay. What are your initial thoughts upon viewing them? And how do these works make you feel and why? Okay, when I first saw these pieces, which thank you to our amazing professor who pointed me in this direction, I was shocked at first. I was like, whoa. Because this was my first time viewing art meant to replicate, the art from Europe back in the day depicting women in the nude like in a seductive manner. And this was my first time seeing men portrayed in that manner. And despite having, taken life drawing years ago and having to have already drawn men in the nude before, this was still quite just jarring in the strangest way. And that made me realize just how accustomed we've become to this idea that female nudity is so normalized, whereas male nudity is seen as wrong in art. And not wrong in the sense that it's bad, but wrong in the sense that it's uncomfortable to look at. And I just find that very interesting because I couldn't quite put it into words why it was making me uncomfortable. Because after all, it is just somebody in the nude. And it brought me back to those assumptions about art. And it made me realize how ingrained these assumptions are in that, especially in that beauty aspect, where you look at it and you're expecting like these beautiful women, these beautiful people, and you're not seeing that. You're just seeing a standard, normal man. And it's just it's a very strange feeling. I'm not quite sure how to put it into words to describe it to you guys. It's just very compelling. And I commend Sylvia Slay for doing this as a means of showing just how sexualized women in art are in that degree where you don't even notice it anymore because it's just so normal and so just accepted. Whereas with this, it's seen as weird and wrong. But I digress. But I just wanted to conclude with that I found these pieces, these works of art, very incredible and very interesting to read about and look about this whole first part of this book. I feel as though it has really opened my eyes to what we consider art and to what pedestal we sort of put certain artistic values on and why we might put those values on these specific things. And it makes you really wonder, what truly does count as art if we try to abandon these assumptions that were made way before many people had access to that art. It makes you wonder what could have been if art was more accessible back then, considering how accessible it is now. We're seeing so many different forms of art come about in the world, and it makes you just think what could have been created or what could have been a new interpretation had art been more accessible. And it also made me look at society just in general as a whole while reading, and learning about the ways that Berger was able to sort of analyze this behavior of men and women and how it translates to art is just so interesting. And I know I've used interesting a lot, but it was really intriguing to read through this and make notes and ask myself these questions as I was going through this piece, because that's where I came to these questions, was just these were questions popping up for myself, and I was curious to know your guys' answers. And yeah, I'm glad that I got the opportunity to read this, and I cannot wait to finish this book in the next part of class. And thank you guys so much for listening. And I hope the rest of class goes great.